In the heart of Jerusalem, a man became the voice of what many feared to hear. Jeremiah, the weeping prophet, was not just a messenger of God, but a survivor of a silent battle that echoed through the centuries. Have you ever paused to consider the weight he carried? Rejection, pain, and anguish were always at his doorstep, like shadows that never faded. His tears were a deafening cry in an age of apathy. As a messenger amid an indifferent people, Jeremiah faced not only persecution, but also emotional and physical torment. What kind of courage is needed to keep speaking when everyone around you prefers silence? What drives a man to persist in his mission, even when hope seems distant? As the walls of Jerusalem closed in, he became a symbol of resistance. His words, often ignored, were seeds that would take root in future times. What can we learn from his story of faith and suffering? Jeremiah's journey invites us to reflect on the true nature of courage in the face of adversity. Jeremiah was born in a tumultuous time, at the end of the 7th century BC, in a small town called Anathoth, just a few kilometers from Jerusalem. The historical backdrop of his life was marked by significant political and social changes. The kingdom of Judah faced a constant threat from foreign powers, especially Assyria and later Babylon. It was a period of instability, where faith and morality were being tested, and idolatry spread among the people. Traditions and the covenant with God were repeatedly challenged by pagan practices, and Jeremiah found himself at the center of this storm. The historical context also included the rise of new leaders, such as King Josiah, who attempted to implement religious reforms and restore worship of the God of Israel. However, even with these efforts to return to true worship, the roots of corruption and unfaithfulness ran deep. As a young prophet, Jeremiah recognized the urgent need for a genuine return to God, and realized that his role would be to be the voice of warning at a time when many preferred to ignore the spiritual reality of the land. Throughout Jeremiah's life, Jerusalem underwent various transformations, and the temple, which was supposed to be the center of worship, became a symbol of hypocrisy. The people believed they had unshakable protection simply because the temple was in their city. But Jeremiah knew that true security came from obedience to God. He struggled to make the people understand that the presence of the temple was not a guarantee against the consequences of their actions, which made him a prophet in constant conflict. In addition to internal tensions, the external scenario was also concerning. Babylon, under the command of Nebuchadnezzar, was on the rise and would become a significant threat to the kingdom of Judah. Aware of this reality, Jeremiah felt the need to warn the people about the impending judgment. He became the voice crying out in the wilderness, but his warnings were often ignored. It was a time of crisis, and Jeremiah knew that his mission was crucial for the future of his people. Thus, Jeremiah's historical context not only shaped his message, but also imposed an immense emotional and spiritual weight on him. He lived in a transitional period where hope and disillusionment coexisted. Jeremiah was not merely a passive observer. He was deeply involved in the lives of his people, battling against the apathy and despair that surrounded his ministry. Every word he spoke carried the weight of his time, and this would become a recurring theme throughout his life. Jeremiah's calling is one of the most powerful narratives in the Bible. From a young age, he was chosen by God to be a prophet, and his initial response was one of hesitation and fear. Jeremiah, son of Hilkiah, felt inadequate for the task set before him. He expressed his fear with the words, "Ah, sovereign Lord, I do not know how to speak. I am too young." This reaction is common among those called by God and reflects human vulnerability when faced with such a grand mission. However, God was not deterred by Jeremiah's insecurity. He reaffirmed his calling, saying, "Do not say, 'I am too young.' You must go to everyone I send you to and say whatever I command you." This affirmation highlights God's sovereignty in choosing whom he desires to fulfill his promises and messages. From that moment, Jeremiah was endowed with courage and the certainty that he was not alone in his mission. God himself would be with him, protecting and guiding him. Jeremiah's mission was clear. He was to be the voice of God amid a people straying from the right path. His messages would not be easy to hear, as they included warnings about judgment and the need for repentance. Jeremiah was called to confront kings, priests, and the people in general, challenging their beliefs and practices. This task required not only courage, but also a deep sensitivity to what God wanted to communicate. In addition to being a messenger of judgment, Jeremiah had the responsibility to offer hope. He was not merely a prophet of despair, but someone who also spoke of restoration and God's mercy. Amid his warnings, he brought the promise of a new covenant, where God would write his laws on the hearts of his people. This duality in his mission of condemnation and hope made his role even more complex and challenging. Thus, Jeremiah's calling was not just a task to fulfill, it was a way of life. He would become a symbol of resistance in a time of apostasy, and his willingness to listen to and obey God, despite his fears, would shape his legacy as one of Israel's greatest prophets. His prophetic mission was not just for his time, it would echo through generations, leaving a lasting impact on the history of faith. Jeremiah's messages were like an echo of warnings that resonated amid the people's disobedience. He did not hesitate to proclaim God's judgment upon Judah, alerting them that infidelity and idolatry would lead to destruction. His language was strong and direct, reflecting the urgency of the situation. Jeremiah spoke not only as a prophet, but as someone deeply concerned about the fate of his nation. He cried out for repentance, urging the people to abandon their wicked ways and return to God. One of the central themes in his messages was the warning about the Babylonian invasion. Jeremiah told the people that if they continued to disobey, the city of Jerusalem would be besieged and the temple would be destroyed. This idea was devastating for the inhabitants of Judah, who viewed the temple as a symbol of safety. However, Jeremiah insisted that protection did not come from buildings, but from a right relationship with God. His insistence on this message of judgment reflected the urgency he felt in his soul. Moreover, Jeremiah did not limit himself to speaking about impending judgment. He also proclaimed the need for genuine repentance. He urged the people to turn to God with all their hearts, to practice justice, and to care for the oppressed. His words were a call to action, an invitation for the people to reconsider their choices and seek true worship. The message of repentance was an opportunity for a fresh start, a reminder that even in the face of inevitable judgment, there was hope for restoration. The people's resistance to these messages was one of the greatest challenges faced by Jeremiah. He often encountered rejection and hostility, as many preferred to ignore the warnings and continue their corrupt practices. Jeremiah became a target of mockery and disdain. He felt lonely in his mission, but his determination to speak the truth did not waver, even when his words were met with hostility. For him, faithfulness to God was more important than popular acceptance. Jeremiah's messages of judgment and repentance were not just for his time, they echoed through generations. His call to justice and truth resonates even today, challenging people to reflect on their actions and their relationships with God. The legacy of his messages continues to inspire those who seek truth and justice, reminding everyone that repentance is always a possibility, no matter how distant one may feel from God. The opposition Jeremiah faced was a constant in his prophetic life. From the beginning of his ministry, he became a target of criticism and rejection. The people around him, including religious and political leaders, were unwilling to hear his messages of judgment and repentance. Instead of embracing the truth he proclaimed, many chose to turn against him, attacking his credibility and character. This persecution was often painful and isolating. One of the most striking moments of Jeremiah's rejection occurred when he was imprisoned for his prophecies. Authorities, disturbed by his messages that criticized corrupt practices and the false security of the people, decided to silence him. He was thrown into a cistern, where he remained trapped in mud and filth, a symbol of how truth is often treated in times of corruption. This experience not only tested his faith, but also highlighted the resistance he faced in his mission. Jeremiah's rejection was not limited to authorities. It extended to his own family and friends. He often felt lonely in his struggle, lamenting his condition before God. The words of Jeremiah, filled with pain and anguish, reveal, the consequences of the prophetic message of Jeremiah, a theme that makes me reflect on the impacts that truth can have on people's lives. Jeremiah was not just any prophet. His voice echoed during times of great crisis and moral deviation in Israel. he preached about the need for repentance and the consequences of disobedience to God. Unfortunately, many were not ready to listen. His words, which were meant to bring hope and change, were often seen as a burden rather than a call to reflection. Jeremiah's message went beyond simple warnings. He spoke about the imminent judgment of God, and this brought direct consequences. Many people, feeling threatened, responded with anger and contempt. The truth he preached became a thorn in the side of leaders and citizens who preferred to live in denial. The city of Jerusalem, which should have been a beacon of faith and justice, was steeped in idolatrous practices and social injustices. Thus, Jeremiah's message became a mirror reflecting not only the spiritual condition of the people, but also their moral failings. The consequences of Jeremiah's message became evident when the people began to experience the calamities he had predicted. The Babylonian invasion and exile were undoubtedly traumatic events that changed Israel's trajectory. All of this stemmed from the refusal to heed the call to repentance. Cities were devastated, and many were taken far from their homeland, a fate Jeremiah had announced with tears in his eyes. As a man, he felt the pain of his people in his own flesh, and that pain became part of his own story. Moreover, there is an interesting aspect to consider: the influence his prophecies had on subsequent generations. Even after the exile, Jeremiah's message continued to resonate among the people. His words became a warning for future generations about the dangers of disobedience and idolatry. It was as if he were a voice transcending time, reminding everyone that the relationship with God is something to be cultivated with seriousness and reverence. Thus, his messages, although initially rejected, gained new meaning as the people began to understand the profound consequences of their actions. Ultimately, the consequences of Jeremiah's message were not only about punishment, but also about the hope of restoration. He was not a prophet who merely brought bad news. His messages also spoke of the possibility of repentance and renewal. The tears he shed were not just of sorrow, but also of love and a desire to see his people return to righteous paths. Therefore, even amidst so much tragedy, his voice echoed with a call to hope, a light at the end of the tunnel that many were still reluctant to see. When we talk about Jeremiah's imprisonment and torture, it is impossible not to feel a certain indignation. A man who dedicated his life to warning his people about the dangers they faced ended up being the target of the very rejection he was trying to combat. Jeremiah's imprisonment was not just an act of violence. It was a reflection of the fear that leaders and authorities felt regarding the truth he preached. They knew that his words had the power to shake the established power structures, and the response was brutal repression. From the beginning of his ministry, Jeremiah faced resistance, but the situation worsened when his prophecies began to come true. He was imprisoned not only for speaking the truth, but for being a symbol of what they did not want to confront. The feeling of helplessness in the face of the truth he brought led to a series of abuses and tortures. What impacts me the most is that, even amidst suffering, Jeremiah remained steadfast in his faith. He knew that his mission was more important than his personal well-being, and that is truly admirable. The tortures he endured were not merely physical. There was emotional and spiritual torment that he had to bear. The loneliness of being imprisoned, the sense of betrayal by his own people, and the pain of seeing the city he loved crumble under the weight of sin and disobedience. All these experiences further shaped his message, making it deeper and more laden with meaning. The pain became part of his speech, and yet he continued to cry out for repentance and change. King Jehoiakim and other authorities were so concerned with preserving their own interests that they did not hesitate to silence Jeremiah's voice. His imprisonment was an attempt to stifle the truth, but the irony is that, even in his cell, he managed to convey messages of hope and warning. History shows us that the truth, no matter how repressed, always finds a way to manifest. And this teaches us something about the resilience of faith and the prophetic mission, which do not falter in the face of adversity. Ultimately, Jeremiah's imprisonment was not just a matter of injustice, it was an opportunity for him to deepen his relationship with God. During moments of pain and solitude, he found comfort in divine promises. His experience reminds us that even in the darkest circumstances, the light of faith can shine brightly. Despite everything, Jeremiah continued to be a spokesperson for God, and this is something we should always keep in mind when discussing the struggle for truth. When I reflect on the role of King Jehoiakim and the religious leaders in the persecution of Jeremiah, I feel we are faced with a true human tragedy. Jehoiakim, a king who should have been an example of leadership and justice, allowed himself to be swayed by corruption and fear. He, along with the religious leaders of the time, not only ignored the prophet's warnings, but also decided to silence him in every possible way. This scenario prompts us to reflect on how power can corrupt and distort the truth. Jehoiakim was not just concerned about his image, he feared losing control over the people. Jeremiah's words were like a ticking time bomb, ready to explode amidst his reign. Thus, instead of listening and seeking reconciliation, he opted for repression. His decision to persecute Jeremiah revealed not only his weakness, but also exposed the fragility of a system unwilling to confront its flaws. History teaches us that power often chooses ignorance over responsibility. The religious leaders, who should have been the guardians of faith and morality, also became complicit in this persecution. They preferred to align themselves with the king, seeking to maintain their positions of privilege rather than advocating for justice. This is extremely sad, as it shows that, in many cases, the quest for power can eclipse the spiritual mission. Jeremiah, with his message of repentance and call to conversion, challenged both the king and the religious leaders, and this resistance transformed into persecution. The combination of fear and greed led to a situation where Jeremiah's prophetic voice was silenced. The consequences of this persecution were devastating. The people, instead of heeding the message of repentance, found themselves caught in a cycle of disobedience and despair. Truth became a victim, while leaders who should have guided the people toward God were only concerned about securing their own positions and safety. However, it is important to remember that the story does not end with persecution. Jeremiah's resilience, even in the face of such opposition, serves as a powerful reminder that truth will always find a way to emerge, even in the most adverse circumstances. The leaders who opposed him may have temporarily succeeded in silencing his voice, but Jeremiah's words continue to resonate through the ages, challenging each generation to listen and respond to God's call. Ah, Jeremiah, the prophet who was unafraid to expose his vulnerabilities. His letters, especially those reflecting his laments, are a true testament to the weight he carried in his heart. He not only spoke of judgment and the need for repentance, but also allowed himself to feel and express the pain he observed around him. If you have ever had a really heavy day, you can imagine how he felt, not only because of the events he witnessed, but also due to the people's lack of understanding about the gravity of the situation. In his letters, Jeremiah speaks of a deep lament, almost as a confession from someone who feels misunderstood and alone. It is striking to see how he positions himself as an intercessor, someone who, even in his pain, still cares for his people. He expresses not only his personal anguish, but also the sorrow of witnessing the nation drift away from God. This makes me think about how at times we can feel isolated in our own feelings, even when surrounded by others. One of the most touching aspects of Jeremiah's letters is the way he articulates his anguish. He uses poetic language, full of metaphors and vivid imagery, which makes his laments even more impactful. It's as if he is trying to paint a picture of his pain, not only for others to see, but also so they could feel what he was feeling. This resonates with me, as often when we try to communicate, words are not enough to express the depth of our emotions. Moreover, Jeremiah reflects on what seems to be God's absence amid suffering. It is an internal struggle he faces, questioning why things are so bad and where divine intervention is. This leads me to think about how all of us, at some point, may feel that God is distant, especially in times of crisis. The beauty of Jeremiah's words is that he does not hesitate to express this doubt, showing that faith is not merely about passively accepting everything, but also a journey of questioning and seeking answers. Ultimately, Jeremiah's laments are not just a release of emotions, but also a call to reflection. He invites us to look within and consider how our actions affect not only ourselves, but also those around us. It serves as a reminder that even amidst pain, there is room for hope and the possibility of redemption. Thus, Jeremiah's letters become a testament not only to his anguish, but also to his relentless quest for a better future for his people. When discussing Jeremiah's prophecies, it's impossible not to recognize the depth and relevance they hold for both Jewish and Christian theology. Jeremiah was not merely a messenger of God. He was a true pioneer in addressing themes that resonate to this day. His messages of repentance, hope, and restoration are pillars that sustain the faith of millions around the world. As I explore his prophecies, I am amazed by the timeliness and applicability of his words, even centuries later. A crucial aspect of Jeremiah's prophecies is the emphasis on repentance and restoration. He urges the people to acknowledge their wrongs and turn back to God. This idea of repentance is not just a formality, it is an invitation to genuine transformation. In the context of Jewish theology, this message is a call to action, an opportunity for spiritual renewal. For Christians, Jeremiah's message gains even more depth when linked to the figure of Jesus, who also preached about repentance and forgiveness. It's as if Jeremiah's words laid the groundwork for the coming of the Messiah. He did not hesitate to proclaim God's judgment upon Judah, alerting them that infidelity and idolatry would lead to destruction. His language was strong and direct, reflecting the urgency of the situation. Jeremiah spoke not only as a prophet, but as someone deeply concerned about the fate of his nation. He cried out for repentance, urging the people to abandon their wicked ways and return to God. One of the central themes in his messages was the warning about the Babylonian invasion. Jeremiah told the people that if they continued to disobey, the city of Jerusalem would be besieged and the temple would be destroyed. This idea was devastating for the inhabitants of Judah, who viewed the temple as a symbol of safety. However, Jeremiah insisted that protection did not come from buildings, but from a right relationship with God. His insistence on this message of judgment reflected the urgency he felt in his soul. Moreover, Jeremiah did not limit himself to speaking about impending judgment. He also proclaimed the need for genuine repentance. He urged the people to turn to God with all their hearts, to practice justice, and to care for the oppressed. His words were a call to action, an invitation for the people to reconsider their choices and seek true worship. The message of repentance was an opportunity for a fresh start, a reminder that even in the face of inevitable judgment, there was hope for restoration. The people's resistance to these messages was one of the greatest challenges faced by Jeremiah. He often encountered rejection and hostility, as many preferred to ignore the warnings and continue their corrupt practices. Jeremiah became a target of mockery and disdain. He felt lonely in his mission, but his determination to speak the truth did not waver, even when his words were met with hostility. For him, faithfulness to God was more important than popular acceptance. Jeremiah's messages of judgment and repentance were not just for his time, they echoed through generations. His call to justice and truth resonates even today, challenging people to reflect on their actions and their relationships with God. The legacy of his messages continues to inspire those who seek truth and justice, reminding everyone that repentance is always a possibility, no matter how distant one may feel from God. The opposition Jeremiah faced was a constant in his prophetic life. From the beginning of his ministry, he became a target of criticism and rejection. The people around him, including religious and political leaders, were unwilling to hear his messages of judgment and repentance. Instead of embracing the truth he proclaimed, many chose to turn against him, attacking his credibility and character. This persecution was often painful and isolating. One of the most striking moments of Jeremiah's rejection occurred when he was imprisoned for his prophecies. More broadly, Jeremiah's legacy is reflected in the way we approach themes such as justice, repentance, and hope in art. His work invites artists to explore the complexity of the human condition, to question the morality of society, and to express the pain and beauty of life. This influence is evident in many works that address social and ethical issues, showing that Jeremiah's message remains relevant in a world that continues to face similar challenges. Ultimately, reflecting on Jeremiah's legacy makes it clear that it transcends the barriers of time and culture. His words and his life continue to inspire and challenge those who seek truth and justice. His influence on literature and art is a testament to the impact that a single individual can have when standing up amid adversity and speaking on behalf of God, becoming a lasting voice that resonates through generations. Throughout his life, Jeremiah teaches us that true faith is often marked by suffering and rejection. But the question remains, how far would you go for what you believe? The prophet wept not only for his own pain, but for a people who turned away from God, for a nation that ignored his warnings. Imagine his solitude, feeling the weight of a message that few wanted to hear. Have you ever felt that way? Have you had to fight alone for your convictions? This is the essence of Jeremiah's journey. He didn't just prophesy, he lived every word, every tear, every moment of anguish. Today, as we reflect on his story, we might ask ourselves, how can we be voices of hope in difficult times? Are we willing to be like Jeremiah, even when the path becomes desolate? If you were moved by this story, share in the comments how you deal with your own struggles. And remember, every tear, every battle is an opportunity for growth. Subscribe to the channel for more stories that touch the soul and challenge our faith. Together, let's explore more about the Bible and the signs of the end times.